The thermometer read -43 degrees when Duncan MacLeod found his brother frozen inside their cabin. The fire had burned all night, the walls were chinked tight, and Hamish still died from the cold that seeped through solid logs like water through cloth. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if frontier survival stories like this one move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale of mountain ingenuity will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about building in the wilderness. Duncan MacLeod woke to silence. That was the first wrong thing. His brother Hamish snored like a wounded bear, had done so since childhood in the Highlands, continued the habit through 7 winters in the Wyoming Territory mountains. But on this February morning in 1838, the cabin held only the sound of wind scraping across the roof. Duncan sat up on his sleeping platform, breath clouding white in the dim light, filtering through the oiled paper window. The fire had died. The stone hearth held only gray ash and the faint heat memory of last night's flames. He looked across the small cabin to where Hamish slept on the opposite platform. His brother hadn't moved. Duncan crossed the dirt floor in 3 strides, his bare feet burning with cold. He touched Hamish's shoulder. The body was rigid beneath the buffalo robe, frozen solid. Duncan pulled back the hide and saw his brother's face, gray-blue, eyes half open, frost crystals in his beard. Hamish had died sometime after the fire went out, probably around midnight when the last log burned to coals. Duncan stumbled backward, hit the table, caught himself. He stared at his brother's body, trying to understand what had happened. They'd stacked firewood before sleeping, a full night's worth carefully measured. The fire had burned properly. The cabin was tight. They'd chinked every gap between logs just 2 months earlier, packing clay and moss into any space that showed daylight. The door fit snugly. The window was covered. This was a good cabin, built well, maintained properly. But Hamish was dead. Duncan rebuilt the fire, not for warmth, but because he needed something to do with his hands. Outside, the morning sun reflected off snow with blinding intensity. The temperature was probably 20 below, maybe colder, the kind of cold that made trees crack like rifle shots. He spent the morning digging through frozen earth to bury Hamish on a rise overlooking the creek where they'd trapped beaver for 3 seasons. The work took 4 hours. He wrapped his brother in the buffalo robe and lowered him into the shallow grave. He spoke no words and piled stones over the mound to keep scavengers away. When he returned that afternoon, Duncan examined the cabin with eyes looking for failure. He ran his hands along interior walls, feeling the chinking between logs. In a dozen places he felt air movement, tiny currents of cold seeping through gaps he'd thought were sealed. He pressed his palm against a log. The wood was cold, genuinely cold, as if exterior temperature had conducted straight through 8 inches of pine. He walked the perimeter outside, studying corners where logs notched together. Even with fresh chinking, the joints showed small gaps. The door's thick planks let wind whistle around the edges. The window was worse. Cold radiated from it like an open hole. Duncan spent that night alone, feeding the fire constantly, and he understood something that would change everything. The cabin hadn't failed because they'd built it poorly. Log cabins, built the way everyone built them, couldn't hold heat. The wood conducted cold, the chinking cracked, the gaps let wind infiltrate. A man could burn wood all night and still freeze because walls bled heat faster than any fire could generate it. His brother hadn't died from bad luck or inadequate preparation. Hamish had died because the cabin was fundamentally flawed for extreme cold, and Duncan realized that if he stayed in these mountains, he needed to build something different, something that didn't just resist cold, but actually held warmth. Spring arrived late in 1838. Snow lingered in the high valleys through April, and Duncan MacLeod worked his trap lines with mechanical efficiency, his mind elsewhere. He couldn't shake the image of Hamish's frozen face, couldn't stop thinking about the cabin that had failed them. Other trappers he encountered spoke of the brutal winter, of near misses and close calls. 3 men had frozen to death across the territory. Everyone had stories of burning through wood supplies, of huddling near fires that barely kept the cold at bay. Duncan listened, but said little. He was trying to solve a problem that had no obvious answer. In early May, while checking beaver sets along a creek 15 miles from his cabin, a late spring snowstorm rolled down from the mountains. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. Wind drove wet snow horizontally across the valley. Duncan needed shelter immediately. He spotted an abandoned homestead, a failed settler's attempt from years earlier. The cabin had collapsed, but a hay barn still stood, its roof mostly intact. He pushed through the barn's sagging door and climbed into the hay pile that filled one corner. The hay was old, probably 5 years since anyone had stacked it, compressed under its own weight into a dense mass. Duncan burrowed into it like an animal, pulling hay over himself, creating a hollow space barely large enough for his body. Within minutes, he stopped shivering. Within 10 minutes, he felt genuinely warm. He lay there for 2 hours while the storm raged outside, and during that time Duncan experienced something that contradicted everything he understood about shelter. The hay held heat, not the faint residual warmth of a dying fire, but real sustained heat generated by his own body and trapped by the compressed grass around him. He pushed his hand deeper into the hay pile, away from his body, and felt warmth there too. The interior of the pile was measurably warmer than the barn's air temperature. When the storm passed, Duncan didn't leave immediately. He examined the hay, pulling it apart, studying its structure. Each grass stem was hollow, a tiny tube of dead air. When compressed into a pile, thousands of these stems created countless air pockets. Air was a poor conductor of heat. He knew that from experience. But he'd never considered that you could build a wall of trapped air. Over the following weeks, Duncan observed everything differently. He watched cattle in a rancher's field near Fort Laramie. The animals bedded down in hay during cold nights, burrowing into the piles. They looked comfortable, while horses in a log shed stamped and shifted, their breath clouding heavily. Duncan began cutting prairie grass in June, long before any trapper would normally think about winter preparations. He cut the tall grass that grew in the bottomlands, grass that stood 4 feet high with thick stems. He spread it to dry for a week, then gathered it into bundles. Using a wooden frame he built from lodgepole pine, he compressed the grass into rectangular shapes, binding each bundle tight with rope made from twisted rawhide. When Thaddeus Cartwright stopped by in July and saw Duncan's work, he laughed openly. "MacLeod, you making hay? Where's your cattle?" Duncan didn't explain. He simply continued his work, cutting and binding, creating bale after bale of compressed grass. Duncan MacLeod began construction of his new cabin in August of 1838. He selected a site on elevated ground with clear sight lines and good drainage. The location required hauling water from the creek 50 yards away, but Duncan had learned that convenience mattered less than survival fundamentals. He built the cabin using traditional methods because the log structure would form the inner wall of his design. He cut and hauled lodgepole pines, selecting trees between 10 and 12 inches in diameter. He notched them using standard dovetail joints at the corners. The walls went up in 2 weeks. He chinked between logs with clay, moss, and sand, packing it tight into every gap. He built a stone fireplace in one corner with a chimney that drew well. The cabin measured 12 feet by 16 feet inside. He installed a thick plank door with iron hinges and covered the single window with oiled paper. By mid-September, he had a serviceable log cabin that would have satisfied any experienced trapper. Then he began the work that made other men laugh. Thaddeus Cartwright was the first to witness it. He rode up on a September afternoon and found Duncan stacking hay bales against the cabin's north wall, positioned vertically in horizontal courses like oversized bricks. 3 courses were already in place, reaching nearly 4 feet high. "MacLeod, what in God's name are you doing?" Thaddeus asked. Building, Duncan said, lifting another bale into position. Building what? That's hay. You're stacking hay against your cabin. I am. Thaddeus walked around the structure, examining the bales. Each one was roughly 18 inches thick, 14 inches tall, and 2 feet long. Duncan had left gaps of about an inch between each horizontal course. Vertical oak stakes driven through multiple bales held them in place. You've lost your mind, Thaddeus said finally. The grief over Hamish has addled your thinking. Duncan positioned another bale, drove a stake through it. Maybe. Hay belongs in barns or feeding livestock, not on cabin walls. Perhaps it belongs in both places. Thaddeus mounted his horse, shaking his head. Winter will teach you the error of this foolishness, MacLeod. That hay will rot with the first heavy snow, and you'll be tearing it all down by December. Duncan said nothing. He simply continued his work. By October, he had wrapped all 4 sides of the cabin in hay bales. The structure looked bizarre, like a log cabin wearing a golden overcoat too large for its frame. The gaps between bale courses showed clearly, and when the first October snow came, white accumulated in those horizontal spaces, making the wall look incomplete. Word spread through the trapping community. Men rode out of their way to see MacLeod's hay fort. They stood in groups, pointing and laughing. Someone started calling it the feed pile cabin. Another called it MacLeod's folly. Duncan extended his roof overhang 12 inches beyond the original roofline, creating a protective cap over the bale tops. He completed the work in late October as temperatures began their steady decline. He had built something that had no name, no precedent, no place in frontier construction vocabulary. And he had no idea if it would work. By early November of 1838, Duncan MacLeod's cabin had become a destination for curious trappers. Men traveling between Fort Laramie and the northern trapping grounds made detours to witness what Thaddeus Cartwright described in trading posts as the most ridiculous structure ever built in the Wyoming Territory. On a cold afternoon, with the first serious snow falling, 5 trappers arrived at Duncan's cabin together. Thaddeus led the group, bringing 2 American trappers and a German named Klaus Fischer. They stood in a semicircle, studying the hay-wrapped structure, while Duncan split firewood nearby. Explain the thinking, MacLeod, Thaddeus said. What possessed you to wrap a perfectly good cabin in livestock feed? Duncan set down his axe. The hay holds warmth. Hay holds warmth, Thaddeus repeated slowly, glancing at his companions. Like a blanket holds warmth? Is your cabin cold, MacLeod? Does it need a coat? The other men laughed. One of the Americans walked closer to the wall, touched a bale, pulled at the compressed grass. This will rot by spring. Moisture will get into it. Turn it to mush. The gaps. Between courses let moisture escape, Duncan said. The gaps make it look like you ran out of hay halfway through, the other American said. And look, snow's already collecting in those spaces. Your wall is filling with snow. How does that hold warmth? Duncan had no answer that would satisfy them. He understood that the snow in the gaps would melt from interior heat, that this minor loss was insignificant compared to the massive insulation value of the bales themselves. But he couldn't explain the physics in terms that would convince men who saw only hay stacked against logs. Klaus Fischer circled the entire structure before speaking. In my homeland we build with stone, with thick walls. This is thick, ja. But stone does not burn. Stone does not rot. Stone does not feed mice and rats. Stone also doesn't grow in meadows ready for harvest, Duncan said quietly. True, Klaus admitted, but stone also doesn't make a man look like a fool. Thaddeus stepped closer to Duncan. I knew your brother. Hamish was a good man. His death was hard, I'll grant you that. But this? He gestured at the cabin. This isn't honoring his memory. This is madness born from grief. You've wasted an entire summer building a joke. Duncan met his eyes. Winter will tell. Yes, Thaddeus agreed. Winter will tell us that Duncan MacLeod built a cabin that looks like a barn, functions like a tinderbox, and will be torn down by spring when you admit this folly." The men mounted their horses and rode away, their laughter carrying back through the falling snow. Duncan watched them go, then returned to splitting wood. He stacked the split logs inside his cabin, noting how little space they occupied. He'd cut perhaps 1/3 the firewood he'd normally prepare for winter. If his calculations were wrong, if the hay walls didn't perform as he hoped, that shortage would kill him before spring. But he didn't believe his calculations were wrong. He'd spent months observing, testing, thinking through every aspect of how heat moved through materials. The hay would work. It had to work, because he'd bet his life on it. Duncan MacLeod finished stacking his firewood on a cold afternoon in late November. The pile was noticeably smaller than previous years, perhaps 2 cords instead of 6. He stood back and studied it with careful attention. If the hay walls failed, this wood wouldn't last past January, but if his understanding was correct, he'd need far less fuel than traditional cabins required. Elk Runner arrived 2 days later, riding a paint horse and leading a pack mule loaded with buffalo robes for trade. The Crow guide had traveled through this region for 15 years, knew every trapper between the Yellowstone and the North Platte. He dismounted slowly, studying Duncan's cabin with an expression that showed neither mockery nor approval. "The other trappers speak of this," Elk Runner said, walking around the structure. "They say you have built something strange." "They say I've built something foolish," Duncan corrected. Elk Runner touched one of the hay bales, pressed his palm against it, examined the gaps between courses. "May I see inside?" Duncan opened the door. The interior was simple: sleeping platform, table, fireplace, shelves for supplies. Elk Runner stood in the center of the room, silent for a long moment. Then he placed his hand against the interior log wall, moved to another section, repeated the gesture. "The logs are not cold," he observed. "No," Duncan agreed. "In other cabins, the logs are cold. Even near the fire, the walls pull heat away. But these walls do not." Duncan explained his reasoning carefully. Each grass stem was hollow, he said. Inside that tube was air. Air didn't conduct heat well. That was why birds fluffed their feathers in winter, why animals grew thick fur. The trapped air created insulation. But a single grass stem provided almost no insulation because it was too thin. The innovation came from compression. When you packed thousands of grass stems together into a bale 18 inches thick, you created thousands of hollow tubes running through the bale's depth. Each tube held trapped air. The compressed grass prevented wind from moving through the bale, which meant the air stayed trapped, stayed still, stayed effective as insulation. The gaps between bale courses added another layer of protection. Those spaces created additional dead air pockets. Dead air was the best insulator available in nature. Better than wood, better than stone. The total wall system, bales plus gaps, plus the airspace between bales and interior logs, created a barrier that heat couldn't easily escape through. Elk Runner listened without interruption. When Duncan finished, the guide nodded slowly. "Our people use grass for winter shelters in some places. We pile it thick over frames. Not like this, not with your bales, but we know grass holds warmth when used properly." "Have other trappers asked you about this?" "Thaddeus Cartwright asked if you had lost your mind. I told him, grief makes men do strange things." Elk Runner paused. "But this is not strange. This is clever." He stayed for an hour, trading buffalo robes for steel traps. Before leaving, our Elk Runner turned back from his horse. "Winter will be hard this year. The signs are clear. Your walls will be tested fully. If you survive comfortably, tell me." Duncan watched him ride away into the gray afternoon. The validation, small as it was, mattered. Early winter arrived with unusual ferocity in 1838. By late October, temperatures that normally held above freezing through November had already dropped to 0. Snow fell in heavy blankets that accumulated faster than it could melt. The streams began freezing at their edges, and beaver ponds developed ice thick enough to walk on. Old trappers at Fort Laramie spoke of similar conditions in years past, winters that came early and stayed late, that killed the unprepared. Duncan MacLeod settled into his cabin and began the careful routine of winter survival. He checked trap lines every 3 days, bringing in beaver pelts. He rationed food supplies and maintained equipment, and he monitored his firewood consumption with obsessive attention. In a normal cabin during weather this cold, he would burn a full cord of wood every 10 days. The fire would need constant feeding, flames kept high to push back cold that seeped through log walls. But in his hay-wrapped cabin, Duncan found he could let the fire burn low, sometimes down to coals, and interior temperature barely changed. He burned perhaps 1/4 the wood he'd used in previous winters. The hay walls worked exactly as he'd hoped. Heat stayed trapped inside the thick grass envelope. The compressed bales prevented wind infiltration. The gaps between courses created additional insulation through trapped dead air. In early November, Duncan needed to retrieve a draw knife he'd lent to Thaddeus Cartwright. He made the 2-mile journey on a morning when temperature sat around 5 below zero. The sky was clear, the sun bright but providing no warmth. His breath froze in his beard. Thaddeus's cabin looked standard from outside, solid log construction, smoke pouring from the chimney. Duncan knocked and entered when called. The interior hit him like a physical force. Despite a fire roaring in the hearth, flames reaching halfway up the chimney, the cabin was brutally cold. His breath still clouded. The walls radiated cold. Frost had formed on interior logs near corners and around the window. Thaddeus sat close to the fire, wrapped in buffalo robes, feeding logs into flames with methodical regularity. "MacLeod," he said, "come for your draw knife. It's on the shelf there." Duncan retrieved the tool, but Thaddeus stood and approached him. "How's your hay palace holding up?" "It's holding fine," Duncan said. "And you're warm enough?" "I'm comfortable." Thaddeus studied him for a moment. "You're not shivering," he observed. "You just walked 2 miles in 5 below cold, and you're not shivering. I've been sitting next to this fire for an hour, and I'm still cold." Duncan said nothing. "How much wood are you burning?" Thaddeus asked quietly. "Less than before." "How much less?" "About 1/4 of what I used to." Thaddeus turned back to his fire, fed another log into it. "Get out of here, MacLeod. Take your draw knife and go." Duncan left without another word. But as he walked back through the brittle cold, he understood something important. Thaddeus had seen the difference. He'd felt it. And Thaddeus talked to every trapper in the territory. The first crack had appeared in the wall of skepticism. December arrived with what would be remembered as the freeze, 3 weeks of sustained cold that drove temperatures to depths the Wyoming Territory hadn't seen in a generation. The mercury dropped below -30 and stayed there. Then it dropped further, -35, -40. On the worst nights, -45. Trees exploded in the forests with sounds like rifle shots, their sap freezing and expanding until the wood burst. Animals that ventured from shelter died within hours. The sky stayed clear and hard, the sun offering light but no warmth whatsoever. Duncan MacLeod watched the mercury thermometer he'd purchased in St. Louis the previous summer. He'd mounted it inside his cabin near the door, away from the fireplace, to get an accurate reading of interior temperature. Outside, the cold was murderous. Inside his hay-wrapped cabin, the temperature held steady around 5 degrees above zero. Not warm by any normal standard, but survivable, comfortable even, with proper clothing and a small fire. He burned minimal wood, a small fire in the morning, another in the evening. Between fires, he let the coals die down to ash, and the cabin temperature dropped only a few degrees over several hours. The hay walls held heat with an efficiency that still surprised him despite months of planning. The thick, compressed grass created a barrier the cold simply could not penetrate quickly. Duncan knew what was happening in other cabins because trappers began abandoning them. On the 5th day of extreme cold, 2 men passed his cabin heading south toward Fort Laramie. They were traveling together for safety, their faces wrapped in cloth, ice crusting their beards. They'd given up trying to maintain their individual cabins. The wood consumption was unsustainable, and even burning constantly, they couldn't keep interior temperatures above -10. On the 8th day, a trapper named William Morrison froze to death in his cabin 12 miles north. Word reached Duncan through Elk Runner, who was checking on scattered trappers. Morrison had burned through his entire wood supply by the 6th day. He'd started burning his furniture, then his doorframe, then anything that would combust. When the fuel ran out, the cold killed him within hours. Duncan offered shelter to any trapper who needed it, but his cabin was remote, and few knew exactly where he'd built. Those who did know were the same men who'd mocked his construction. Pride kept them from seeking help until desperation overrode shame. The thermometer became Duncan's constant reference point. He documented temperatures obsessively, comparing exterior to interior readings. The differential was consistent. When outside temperatures hit -43, interior temperatures stayed around +5. A difference of 48 degrees when outside moderated to -35, interior held at +8, roughly 43 degrees of difference. The hay walls weren't just working. They were performing beyond his initial calculations. The system of compressed grass, air gaps between courses, and the dead air space between bales and interior logs created insulation that approached the theoretical maximum possible with available materials. But documenting success in isolation meant nothing. Duncan needed witnesses. He needed other trappers to see, to feel, to understand what was possible. Otherwise, his innovation would die with him, just another strange experiment by a grief-stricken man who got lucky one winter. The opportunity for witnesses came on the 13th night of the freeze, when the temperature dropped to -47 degrees and someone started pounding on his door after midnight. Duncan MacLeod woke to pounding on his cabin door. Heavy, desperate blows that shook the frame. He rose from his sleeping platform, disoriented in the darkness. The fire had burned down to coals, but the cabin interior still held warmth. He opened the door and Thaddeus Cartwright nearly fell through the entrance. The Englishman was shaking violently, ice coating his beard and eyebrows, his hands clawed into rigid shapes inside frozen mittens. His eyes showed the glassy confusion of advancing hypothermia. Fire went out. Thaddeus managed through chattering teeth. Couldn't get it started again. Hands wouldn't work. Duncan pulled him inside, slammed the door against the wind. He stripped off Thaddeus's frozen outer layers, wrapped him in buffalo robes, positioned him near the fireplace. He built up the coals, added kindling, got flames going. Thaddeus shook so violently the sleeping platform rattled beneath him. Duncan heated water, forced Thaddeus to drink it in small sips. He rubbed the man's hands and feet, checking for frostbite. The fingers were white but not black. After 20 minutes, Thaddeus's shaking began to subside. After 40 minutes, he could speak without his teeth chattering. "How cold is it outside?" Thaddeus asked. Duncan checked his exterior thermometer through the window. -47. Thaddeus stood slowly, walked to the wall, placed his palm against the interior logs. He moved to another section, repeated the gesture. "It's not cold, the walls. They're barely cool." "The hay holds heat," Duncan said. "No, it's more than that. My cabin has a fire twice this size, and I can still see my breath. Your fire is down to coals, and it's actually warm in here." Thaddeus sat at the table, studying the cabin's construction. "The gaps between the hay bales, I thought they were a mistake, but they're intentional, aren't they? Dead air pockets, additional insulation, and the space between the hay and the logs? Same principle. Trapped air is the best insulator." Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment. "How much wood have you burned this winter? Maybe a cord total?" "I've burned 4 cords, and I'm still freezing every night." Thaddeus looked at his hands, flexed his fingers. "I almost died tonight. The cold was pulling heat out of my body faster than I could generate it. If I hadn't made it here, I'd be frozen in a snowbank right now. Duncan poured more hot water into a tin cup, handed it to Thaddeus. "I was wrong," Thaddeus said quietly. "About the hay, about your methods, about calling this madness. You didn't just survive Hamish's death, you solved the problem that killed him." "Yes," Duncan agreed. "Will you teach me? Show me how to build this? When the freeze breaks?" "Yes." Thaddeus stayed 3 days, sleeping on Duncan's floor, waiting for temperatures to moderate enough to travel safely. During those days, he studied every aspect of the hay wall construction from inside. He touched the walls constantly, measuring their temperature with his hands. He watched how the fire behaved, how little wood Duncan needed to maintain comfort. He asked questions about bale thickness, gap spacing, roof overhang, pinning methods. By the time Thaddeus left, riding slowly south through cold that had moderated to -20, he understood exactly what Duncan had created and why it mattered. More importantly, he would tell every trapper he encountered what he'd witnessed. The mockery was over. The validation had begun. Spring arrived in 1839 with the slow thaw that always followed brutal winters. Snow melted gradually, revealing frozen corpses of deer and elk that hadn't survived the extreme cold. The trapping community had lost 4 men during the freeze, including William Morrison. Stories circulated at Fort Laramie about the winter's severity, about cabins abandoned, about trappers who'd burned furniture trying to stay alive. Duncan MacLeod emerged from winter with most of his firewood intact and a full season's worth of beaver pelts. He'd survived comfortably while others had suffered. Word of his hay-wrapped cabin spread through the territory with the speed of valuable information. Thaddeus Cartwright told everyone who would listen about the night Duncan's cabin had saved his life. In late April, Seamus O'Brien appeared at Duncan's cabin. The Irishman was young, perhaps 25, with the careful demeanor of someone who'd learned frontier survival through watching rather than luck. He dismounted and studied the hay walls, walking the entire perimeter before approaching Duncan. "Cartwright sent me," Seamus said. "Told me you'd built something worth seeing. Told me you might teach the method." "He told you true," Duncan said. "I'd like to learn, if you're willing to teach." Duncan spent 3 days with Seamus, explaining every aspect of the construction. How to cut prairie grass when stems were dry but not brittle. How to compress grass into bales using a wooden frame, binding each bundle with rawhide rope. The optimal bale dimensions, 18 inches thick, 14 inches tall, roughly 2 feet long. The importance of leaving intentional gaps between courses for moisture escape and dead air insulation. The vertical pinning system using oak stakes. The necessity of extending the roof overhang to protect bale tops. Seamus asked detailed questions, taking notes on paper. He measured Duncan's bales, studied the corner construction, examined how stakes anchored through hay layers. He placed his hands against interior walls, feeling the temperature difference. "How did you know this would work?" Seamus asked. "I didn't know," Duncan admitted. "I believed it would based on observation, but I didn't know until winter proved it." That took courage. It took necessity. My brother died in a traditional cabin. I needed something different. Seamus left with complete knowledge of the technique. By summer, he was building his own hay-wrapped cabin. By autumn, 2 other trappers had visited Duncan, asking for instruction. Josiah Merrick, a traveling fur trader who moved between territories, saw multiple examples and began spreading word to trappers in Montana and Idaho territories. The technique moved through the mountain man community organically, shared freely, adopted by those who valued survival over tradition. Some called it the odd wall layer. Others called it MacLeod's method, or hay wall cabins. The names varied, but the principle remained constant. Compressed grass, stacked around a log cabin, created insulation that could mean the difference between life and death during extreme winters. Duncan never claimed ownership of the innovation. He'd solved a problem that had killed his brother. Sharing that solution seemed the only reasonable response. By winter of 1840, 7 trappers in Wyoming Territory were living in hay-wrapped cabins. By 1841, the number had grown to over 20. The odd wall layer was spreading without promotion, without profit, simply because it worked. Duncan MacLeod left the Wyoming Territory mountains in the spring of 1846. The fur trade had collapsed. Beaver populations were depleted from decades of trapping, and more significantly, silk had replaced beaver felt in hat production. The economic engine that had driven men into the wilderness had simply stopped. Trappers were leaving the mountains in groups, heading to Oregon, California, or back to eastern settlements. Duncan sold his traps and gear at Fort Laramie for a fraction of what he'd paid. He kept his rifle, his horse, and enough supplies for the journey west. He rode out in May, joining a wagon train headed to Oregon Territory. He didn't look back at his cabin or at the grave where Hamish was buried. That part of his life was finished. In Oregon, Duncan purchased land in the Willamette Valley using money he'd saved from 8 seasons of trapping. He built a small ranch, raised cattle, grew wheat. In 1847, he married Fiona Campbell, a Scottish woman who'd come west with her family the previous year. They had 3 children over the next decade. Duncan became a quiet, respected member of the farming community. He rarely spoke of his mountain years, but in the mountains, his cabins remained. The hay walls weathered and aged, but didn't rot as critics had predicted. The compressed grass, protected by extended roof overhangs, maintained structural integrity for years. Settlers moving west in the 1850s discovered abandoned, hay-wrapped cabins and recognized their superior construction. Some were reoccupied. Others served as way stations for travelers. The structures stood as silent proof that the technique worked. The phrase, built with the odd wall layer, became frontier shorthand for construction that could withstand extreme conditions. Trappers and settlers who'd never met Duncan MacLeod built variations of his design, adapting the principle to available materials and specific climates. Some used one hay wall facing prevailing winds. Others wrapped entire structures. The specific implementations varied, but the core insight remained constant. Compressed grass created insulation that dramatically outperformed traditional log construction. Modern thermal calculations confirm what Duncan understood intuitively. Standard log cabin construction provided roughly R10 insulation value. Duncan's hay bale system, including the bales themselves, the air gaps between courses, and the dead air space between bales and interior logs, provided R60 to R70 insulation, a 6 to 7-fold improvement in thermal performance. The 33-degree temperature differential he documented during the freeze of 38 was scientifically accurate, a direct result of superior building physics applied with frontier materials. Over the 2 decades following Duncan's innovation, the technique saved an estimated 30 to 40 lives during extreme winter conditions across the Rocky Mountain territories. The exact number is impossible to determine because survival often goes unrecorded. But journals and letters from the period include multiple references to hay-wrapped cabins providing crucial shelter during life-threatening cold. Duncan MacLeod died in 1872 at age 59 on his Oregon ranch. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Salem. His gravestone mentioned nothing of mountains, trapping, or hay walls. To his family, he was simply a rancher who'd lived a quiet, productive life. But in the mountains of Wyoming, his walls still stood, weathered, aged, but solid. Physical proof that one man's grief-driven innovation had changed how people survived in one of the harshest environments on the American frontier.